Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. You know, when I scheduled this, Billy, I didn't realize something. One, I didn't realize that it was your birthday and you're doing a presentation on your birthday. So all of you help me wish happy birthday to Billy. I'll spare everybody's for me singing. So happy birthday. Thank you for...
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody else that has a birthday this year. You have a great one as well. So, no, I'm glad to be with you. I'm really excited about today's show. We're going to continue our third part in this Values of Woodlands series that we've been doing over the last couple of months. So today we're going to be focusing more on wildlife and timber products, non-timber products. And we're going to have Dr. Matt Springer come in and talk about generally more about wildlife and woodlands and kind of that value that wildlife brings. So I'm really excited about today's show. I appreciate everybody being with us. Renee, it's always a pleasure to be with you on From the Woods Today. If you all have questions for me or Dr. Springer after our presentations, please hit us up on the chat function. And if you are on YouTube or if you're a podcast listener, you can hit us up via email at forestry.extension@uky.edu and we can respond that way. But I'm glad to have you all with us. Glad to be with you on kind of a nice day here in Lexington, Kentucky.
Better than the steaminess that we have. I know we've got a little bit going on today, but not as bad as it was. But
Yes,
appreciate you doing the presentation today, and you can take it away.
all right, let's get her rolling. All right, folks. So today we're going to be continuing our three-part series. I'm going to go ahead and try to get rid of these little meeting controls. And we're going to be talking about kind of what makes our woodlands valuable and some of the actions that we can do as owners and caretakers of woodlands to make them better for whatever we're trying to manage for what we're interested in. And today we're going to be focusing more on wildlife and timber and non-timber forest products. So again, third part in a three-part series today. All right, so in the first part, we went over kind of talking about what were the values that we think about when we're talking about woodlands. And, you know, value is it can be a little bit of a loaded term. It's really a lot in the eye of the beholder. But there are really some real substantial values that woodlands provide to a lot of different attributes that are out there and to the owners that have them. We talked about the woodlands and soils, that relationship there, and what woodland owners can do to make sure their soils are in as good a shape as possible. Talked about water. We talked about recreational opportunities. And in this third part, we're going to be picking up wildlife as well as timber and non-timber forest products. And then we'll have maybe a brief conversation, if you will, on what you put value on your woodlands, right? If you care about woodlands, what do you care about them? Is it the wildlife? Is it the timber? Is it recreation? Is it a place to go and get away from it all? So all of them are legitimate reasons to own and care for woodlands, and we all have different reasons, and sometimes we have many reasons. So we're going to explore some of those as we go forward today. So let's jump into the wildlife. We all, I think, recognize that woodlands are important to wildlife. Many of our wildlife species are dependent on woodlands at one point in their lives or another. And often many of them spend most of their time in the woods or near the woods. We know that our woodlands provide habitat for these animals to reside in. They provide food and shelter and water and just a wide variety of things. But what they provide can vary a lot depending on the woodlands. We know that our woodlands provide that habitat, right? If you can think about walking through the woods and different size of trees, from little trees to giant trees, those are going to have different species that are going to thrive in those areas. We also know that like transition areas where we go from maybe a field to a wood, that's going to be an important area as well. We call those ecozones. Those are really important. You know, the deadwood that's out there, the snags, all of that are important elements that our wildlife really need from our woodlands, and the woodlands provide for them. So, you know, we might take that for granted sometimes, but really it is that critical infrastructure for our wildlife to have homes and places to live. They also provide a lot of food resources. If you think about our oaks and hickories, you know, here in Kentucky, we're an oak hickory forest for the most part, which means that at least 75% of the main canopy is in oaks and hickories. And the majority of our forests here in Kentucky are classified as oak hickory. And if you think about those nuts that come off of those trees, they're a really important food source for many wildlife species. So that's a really important thing. We also are important from attracting pollinators and insects. All of those play a big part in that food chain for our wildlife. Obviously, wildlife needs water as well, right? And many woodlands do contain water, and landowners can put water on their property if they don't have it, whether that be ponds or wetlands you might have, little shallow areas, streams, or if you're adjacent to rivers. All of those are really important to the whole food chain. Everything needs water, right? And needs high quality water. So woodlands can help provide that. And we talked a little bit more about that in the past. One thing we got to recognize that invasive species can throw a monkey wrench in what our woodlands can provide to wildlife. They can really change that forest into an area that is not as habitable, is not as good a food resource, and is certainly not as diverse as it otherwise might be. So we want to really get a good handle on our invasive species, and whether we care about timber or wildlife. Invasive species management, unfortunately, is something that we have to do on an ongoing basis. And we do know that the sooner we get a hold of these things, the easier it is to get rid of them. So that's just something we got to keep in mind as we go forward. So, what are some of the actions that woodland owners can do, or others who care about wildlife can do when it comes to, wanting to improve habitat or attract different wildlife species? First thing I would encourage you to do is to educate yourself, and parts you're doing that right now. You're trying to learn a little bit about wildlife and woodlands and how they interact and the importance of those. And fortunately, there's a lot of educational opportunities out there for those that are interested. You can also learn more about your woodlands, and the more you know about woodlands and woodland management, the better you're going to be positioned to manage those in a way that support wildlife species of interest to you. The other thing I would strongly recommend, if you're not already, please collaborate with some of our partner organizations that are out there to support you in the care of your woodlands, especially if you're thinking about wildlife. We are so fortunate here in Kentucky to have the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. It's an outstanding state agency that really does a lot for wildlife in the state of Kentucky, but they can also come out and help you manage your private property for wildlife. You just got to kind of make that first connection and reach out to them. Also, our Kentucky Division of Forestry, they do a great deal of work on both woodland and wildlife management related issues, so they're a great resource. And then, if you're not already talking to the Kentucky Natural Resources Conservation Service, you need to do so. They're an outfit that has financial and technical assistance available to help landowners implement conservation practices. So, if you're struggling, you don't really know what to do, there are some organizations that are there to help you, and they want to, they really do, because so much of our land is privately owned in Kentucky and in the eastern United States. What you all do as woodland owners and caretakers of those woods matters to all of us, right? You all get to decide. So we want to help you all be good stewards of those lands. There are some specific woodland management practices we can do that play in nicely with wildlife as well. We have diverse species management, right? What we're looking for is the more diversity in that woodland, the better for wildlife, right? This allows them to have a variety of different areas and sizes where they can hang out. We've had on the show before talking about bird habitat in woods, and we know that we need those mixed stands, right? We need some early successional stuff, we need some mature woods, and we need stuff in between. So having a diversity of those can really make a big difference, right? So that helps provide some resiliency to our woodlands by having those diversity of stands. But again, it provides really diverse habitat for the wildlife we're trying to attract. It's also important when we're doing woodland management, whether it's for wildlife or other purposes, that we really need to monitor the regeneration that's happening. And what I'm talking about is that what's that next forest going to look like? What are the tree seedlings and what are the seed sources that are available that are going to repopulate that area? We want to make sure that we keep an eye on our regeneration and we're tending to it so that when something happens, we have the species in place that we want to take over that stand. So that's something we got to keep an eye on is how are our baby trees, our seed sources, and potential future forest, how are they doing? We don't want to just always look at the mature trees. We need to look at what's coming next as well. Certainly, pests and disease can throw another monkey wrench into all of this. And we've got some diseases that we've talked about here on the show with wildlife that really require some management practices. So just being aware of those and knowing what to do when those things arise is critically important. So connecting with those organizations I mentioned before is a great way to go about doing that. All right, let's continue on. You can implement several different wildlife-friendly actions that we know, and these are commonly known to really enhance wildlife habitat and wildlife populations. One we deal with quite often in our fields is fescue eradication. We know that there are some problems with fescue for some of our wildlife species. So removing that can certainly improve habitat. And well, if you're going to remove that, what are you going to put in its place? Often we see a lot of interest in native warm season grasses here in Kentucky. They're a great resource for our wildlife species, and they provide not only a food source, but good habitat as well. If you do not have water on your property, there are some options to create like little shallow wetlands or vernal pools, if you will. And these can be really important, especially if you do not have a lot of water on your property or nearby, because that's going to be an important resource for wildlife. So adding these to your landscape, if you do not have them, is a great way to kind of enhance that habitat and the resources that the wildlife needs. Not always required, but and sometimes it may be, is planting trees and shrubs. We do know here in Kentucky that if you stop mowing, it's going to turn into a forest eventually, and probably sooner than you think. But it may not be the right trees or the right shrubs that you want, and it may not be the right composition overall to attract the wildlife species that you have. So, depending on what you're trying to work with and trying to provide habitat for or food resources for, that may influence some tree and shrub planting. But again, the best thing I can advise you to do is work closely with those natural resource professionals on your own property. Work with those private biologists that work with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, or those foresters with the Kentucky Division of Forestry, and they can help you make appropriate decisions. Again, we want to enhance and make sure that we've got as much access for food, cover, and water for wildlife as possible. So, really reviewing what you have on your property. Are there some deficiencies in any of those? And if so, what are some of the actions that we can do to try to enhance those? So, just knowing what you have on your property and that from an inventory standpoint can really help you make some good informed decisions about what you need to do to make things even better for the wildlife you're trying to attract. And it's also important that we monitor that wildlife. And fortunately, there's some great trail cameras out there now that you can get a hold of, and you can really keep a good handle on what the wildlife's doing in your woods and around your property. And this is a great way to monitor wildlife in a really non-intrusive way. You can also add some bird boxes or feeders if you're interested in birds onto your property. Again, it's going to vary depending on what you're trying to attract and what you're interested in. So, working with that natural resource professional is really the best way to go about doing that. Okay, we're going to switch gears now to speak about timber and some of the non-timber forest products and how that kind of interacts with woodlands. And often, if it's not wildlife, it's timber that many landowners think about when they think about their woodlands. And again, many of them do think about wildlife first, but timber is one of those things that does come to mind from time to time for many people. And understanding the various timber products that our woodlands can provide is important. Not all woodlands will provide all of these products. It really depends a lot on how well they've been cared for in the past, because we've been abusive to some of our woods over the years, and they may not be as productive as they could have been. But one of the most highest value quality products that we can get out of our trees when we're talking about like timber and wood products is veneer. And veneer, if you're not familiar, is basically where they take a really high quality trees of a variety of species, and they basically shave very thin slices off of those trees. And then they put that thin veneer, if you will, on top of other wood or other products to give it that really nice appearance without having to make the whole thing out of that really high quality wood. So that's going to be your highest quality timber product that you're going to get out of woodlands for the most part when we're talking about wood itself. Next, here in Kentucky, certainly, and throughout the region, a really important one are stave logs. And these are used for making barrels. And this is really limited to our white oak species. Almost exclusively Quercus alba, our native white oak, or our chinkapin oak. We do have some of those species that will, or some of that, those will go into those barrel making as well. This is a really sought after product here in Kentucky woodlands, and many times this may be the only product that is being harvested on woodlands, which is not necessarily a good thing. But there's just so much demand for these logs that can make barrels that they're leaving the woods as quick as they can. They really are. So that's something that a lot of people is on a lot of people's mind, and because the prices for white oak are so high and have been high for a while, and it doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. Next, we kind of drop down to lumber logs, and these are going to be basically sawn into a wide variety of lumber boards, depending on their usages. So, and there's grades and qualities within those. So, certain species are going to be good for certain applications. Certain species are going to find their way into flooring. Others may find their way into furniture or molding, just depending on what we're dealing with. And then we kind of drop down in quality a little bit to tie logs, and these are while they may not be as high quality as some of the other logs that we have, they're also really important. Tie logs that go into making railroad ties are really an important part of our forest industry. They provide a market for some of our lower quality trees that would otherwise stay in the woods and they would never be improving. They would just be staying there taking up growing space. But by having markets for tie logs and some other maybe lower quality products, it really allows us to get in there and implement some forest management practices. And it helps kind of pay that to get that done. And dropping on down to pallet logs, and we're all familiar with shipping pallets and how they're mostly made out of wood, although we're seeing a number of them being made out of plastic now and some maybe other materials. But the wood pallets are also an important kind of lower grade product, and again, low grade just in because they're not that valuable on an individual unit, but being able to harvest and get them out of the woods is a really important thing. And then, we think about biomass and energy. These could be wood chips or pellets or other items that, from a wood standpoint. So, as you can see, there's a wide variety of wood products that come from our trees and forests. And these are all really important, right? They support it here in Kentucky, at least, an extensive wood industry that in total employs more than 50,000 people and has a total economic contribution approaching $18 billion annually. So, it's a big deal here in Kentucky, and it's a big deal for a lot of people. And almost all of that wood comes from privately owned family forests and farms out there. So just knowing what you've got on your property is really important. We also have a wide variety of non-timber forest products that are out there too that we can harvest from our woodlands without having to harvest the trees. Food, there's a lot of food in Kentucky's woodlands. There might be the wildlife might be telling us something, right? They may be spending so much time in there because there's a lot of high quality food in there. And you can think of many of these, whether that be berries or nuts and mushrooms or maple syrup. We've got a number of maple syrup producers here in the state and a growing segment that is really kind of taking advantage of the opportunity to produce high quality maple syrup here in Kentucky. So we can generate a lot of food from our woods and a lot of gleaning, and there's many, many more. There's entire programs that talk about that. We also have a variety of medicinal plants like the ginseng seen here on your left, or golden seal. There's a number of these plants that are out there that do have medicinal properties. One thing I would caution you are often these may be over harvested. So we got to be careful. We got to make sure that we're leaving enough to reestablish and get started. So just because you see maybe a patch in your woods doesn't mean it needs to be completely harvested. I would try to reach out and connect with somebody that's more knowledgeable so that you can ensure that those populations sustain on your property. Certainly, we talked a little bit about that, but wildlife habitat is a non-timber forest product because wildlife is one of the things that we want to attract and have, whether it's for harvesting them or whether it's for taking pictures or just keeping up with what wildlife we have in our woods. So that's another important non-timber forest product. And certainly recreation and aesthetics are also non-timber forest products that we can derive from our woodlands. And they kind of cross the line maybe a little bit with where we were talking about recreation before. But again, just having these resources out there does afford you the opportunity to do some of these things that without having to cut trees down. So you can really enjoy your woods in a lot of different ways. And carbon sequestration, another important one that we talk about often, and it's growing in interest. And there's a number of programs out there. And we have Dr. Jacob Muller in our department that keeps up with that. I would say if you do have questions about carbon programs, that Dr. Muller would be our contact for that. But we do know that our woods are really an important as far as sequestering a lot of carbon. Also, our forest soils play an important role in that as well. So, there's just so many things that our woodlands provide, and often we overlook those, and we may not be taking full advantage of what our woodlands can offer us. So, what are some of the actions that we can do to enhance not only timber but non-forest timber products on our woodlands? Um, Again, I'm like a broken record, but there's a reason. The reason I'm a broken record on getting professional assistance is because each property is so unique and different. What you have to work with is going to be different than your neighbor, whether that's in financial resources or capacity on your land or land use history. So getting that professional out there on your property, working one-on-one with you, really is your best hope to get successful management on your ground that's going to really work for you and your objectives. So get that assistance, right? Work with those folks, the Kentucky Division of Forestry or consultant foresters or others, to have a good management plan for your property, which is going to include a resource assessment of what all you've got out there. And again, that's going to lead into a nice woodland management plan. And think of that as a guide. You have your woodlands, and you may want some things from those. You have objectives for managing those woodlands. So how are you going to get those? That woodland management plan is your guide, your roadmap to help you achieve all that you want from your woodlands. So it's an important part of what we do. It's also really important when it comes to enrolling in some of these programs, whether that be NRCS programs or others, that you have that woodland management plan in place. And then, much like gardening, we need to do some tending and thinning in our woods. If we just let them all grow up all on their own, they're going to kind of grow up in thicket, and then nature will start thinning itself over time. By getting in there and being active, we can kind of influence which species are going to be the winners or losers on that property. And we can make sure that we are kind of maximizing our growing space so that we're not wasting time growing trees that are really not even helping us from any standpoint as compared to other trees that may be able to help us a lot more. So, making sure that we do the management practices that are intended and needed for that property is really important. And again, that comes back to working with those professionals and having that management plan to help guide you on what you're going to be doing. And then eventually, our woods are going to be harvested. I get often asked how much old growth in Kentucky. Not much. Most of our woodlands have been harvested multiple times, and we do have a few pockets of areas that probably were protected from harvesting, largely because they were inaccessible or the quality of the wood wasn't high enough to justify getting up and trying to get them. But there's not a lot of that, right? Most of our woodlands have been harvested multiple times. And so just keep that in mind. They're likely to be harvested again in the future. So even if you don't care about harvesting your woodlands right now, or your children don't, there's a good chance someday down the road, those woodlands are going to be harvested. So we want to make sure that they're done in a sustainable manner. So again, working with a professional, knowing what you're doing in advance of just signing that agreement is really important. Often we have to get our woods ready for a timber harvest. That means we need to get the conditions right so that regeneration can take off once we do that harvest. Or maybe we have invasive species in the area that could cause us a lot of havoc if we were to kind of harvest without treating them first. So a timber harvest can be thought of as a management tool if it's used appropriately, and I strongly encourage you to do so. So additionally, again, mention the invasive species. They really cause so much as far as in terms of problems and challenges to woodland management that it's just hard to really comprehend, and it's a growing issue. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like that's going to change. So these are things that if you're a woodland owner or someone who cares about natural resources, you're going to have to be knowledgeable about invasive species, and you're going to have to know how to kind of control those. The best advice is be vigilant, know what's on your property, and when you do get some of these infestations, trying to treat them as quickly as possible before they have a chance to build up big populations and become basically uncontrollable is the best bet you can do. We also want to maintain our soil health, right? Because that's where all the trees and everything grows or are in the soil. So maintaining good soil health, we want to avoid compaction, or if we're having erosion issues, those are certainly areas that you want to tackle because they can have detrimental impacts on the trees and plants that are trying to grow there. So if those are challenges in your woodlands, I really strongly encourage you to work with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They have some technical expertise on dealing with all of these issues, and they can get you aligned with certain programs that can help you take care of what you need to on your property. There goes. And again, we talked a little bit about tree planting and regeneration. These are things that we have to keep an eye on all the time. Just because we have a sea of trees out there doesn't mean that everything is okay with that woodland. We may not have good regeneration in place, and we may not have the right species that we want. So sometimes we may have to come in and introduce the species that should have been there and that we want there, but it's not there for whatever reasons. Got to keep an eye on forest health as well, not only the invasive species, but are we having some other insects or disease outbreaks? Again, early monitoring and early detection is typically our best bet on these before they can become a problem. And sometimes we may be limited in what options we can do. We've kind of saw that with emerald ash borer as it made its march through Kentucky, and it's still making its way through some areas of the state. But it was devastating, and there was really not a lot that we could do. You could do some salvage harvesting and some other things, but just being aware of what opportunities you have, even if they're minimal, is really an important one. And there may be some opportunities to get some treatment done on some of these invasive plants and or insects and diseases if you're aware of them. So just being, monitoring them, knowing that they're there, gives you a leg up on trying to be able to control them. And again, I mentioned it before, but each woodland is unique unto itself. So we need to make sure that we're tailoring our actions and our activities to the landowner's objectives for that property, but that also has to be matched up with the capacity of the land. We have to be realistic in what we're asking of the land. We're not going to put a black walnut plantation on a ridge top because we know it's not likely to be successful. So you got to be realistic in your expectations. And if you do that and you're working with those professionals, that's going to give you the best chance to make sure that you get your objectives achieved for your property. And I think that's what we all want. And we want to help you do that as quickly and as cheaply and as least frustrating as possible. All right, so let's kind of quickly review the many values that our woodlands provide and some of the things that we can do to maybe enhance each of those. So we'll start with carbon sequestration. We talked about that before, but it's a really important thing. And as we're hearing more and more about climate change and its impact on what's happening on the ground right now, all over the world, we know it's an issue. So if this is something that you're thinking about, you're concerned about, trust me, your woodlands are an important part of that solution because they have the ability to sequester a lot of that carbon, which is causing a lot of the grief up in the air. So maintaining healthy woodlands, right? If your woodlands are healthy and vigorous, they're going to be really actively growing, right? And the more they're growing, the more carbon they're going to be able to sequester, not only in their wood, but also it's going to make its way into our soils as well. So making sure that you've got healthy woodlands and you're doing appropriate conservation practices is some of the best ways you can enhance that carbon sequestration. We talked about the recreational opportunities our woodlands provide, and certainly those are important, whether that be hiking or bird viewing or whatever you like to do out there. Those woodlands are important. So we need to help make it easy for people to do those things, right? And we talked in the past about some of those, but creating a little infrastructure on your woodlands to allow these activities to take place, planning these activities with family, friends, or local Boy Scouts or Girl Scout groups, all give you the opportunity to kind of enhance that recreation on your woodland. Talk about water regulation a little bit and the role that woodlands play in that. And we know that our woodlands are so critical when it comes to filtering our water, helping prevent floods. So we want to make sure that we're doing things that can help those woodlands be resilient to all of those things. And some of the specific things you can do, take care of your riparian areas. If you have woodlands adjacent to water bodies, whether that be streams or rivers, having a good, healthy, vigorous riparian zone with native trees and shrubs is a great way to kind of hold that soil in place. It also helps cool that water and making it better. And so you want to implement any of those best management practices that are related to our water resources. And if you don't have an ag water quality plan and you're a woodland owner, you should get one. Next, we talked a little bit about the cultural values our woodlands provide. Certainly, there's a lot of heritage tied up in our woodlands, and it goes from family cemeteries to maybe the place where grandma and grandpa met under an old oak tree, if you will. There's a lot of values that our woodlands provide, both historically and cultural. So we need to care for those, right? We need to keep those in place. Respect those certainly that they're there, but make actions and make sure that your plan incorporates taking care of those special areas on your property. Because if it's special to you, it's probably special to many others as well. So we want to kind of maintain that for the future the best that we can. Next, we talked about timber production, and certainly we went over all the different timber products that our woodlands can provide, as well as more. But the best thing you can do as a woodland owner or somebody that's advising woodland owners is make sure that we're putting in good management practices, right? We're managing those woodlands based on the objectives of the landowners and the capacity of the land, but we're doing so in a sustainable manner. And what that means is that we're making sure that that future forest has a chance to be just as successful or more successful than the current forest. So if we're going to do that, we have to keep an eye on the ball. We have to make sure that we're harvesting in a way that really enhances that next forest. So think of timber harvest as a management tool, not just a way to kind of extract value out of your woodlands, if you will. And when we think about non-timber forest products, we mentioned a number of those that are there. One of the probably better things that you can do, there are some management practices to enhance some of these things, depending on what you're looking at, but really just promoting good, sustainable collection of these. You don't want to take too many at once. And we mentioned some of these populations have been devastated where people have gone in and basically harvested all of them. And then there's none for the future. So we got to keep an eye on the future. That's such a big part of being a woodland steward, if you will, is kind of an eye for the future. And then we think about biodiversity conservation. There's certainly a lot of that when it comes to our woodlands. We've talked about that. So making sure that you're doing good practices that maintain the health and vigor of your woodlands is going to help all that biodiversity that's out there, right? The healthier our woodlands are, the more they're going to be able to provide for all of the creatures that need and depend on them. So make sure that you're implementing good practices on your ground and protecting any areas that do need protecting. That will enhance biodiversity for sure. All right. So take a moment. What do you value about woodlands? Each of you all out there have some relationship to woodlands. You may be a woodland owner. You may be a natural resource professional that advises woodland owners. You may be somebody that gets to visit and enjoy our woods, whether that be on private property or on some of our public property and state parks or national forests or local parks. Why do you value woodlands, right? And I think we could all come up with a wide variety of reasons why we value woodlands. And the great thing about woodland management is we can try to help accentuate and improve and enhance, if you will, all of those values. But again, working with the professionals is the way to go about that. And if you are a woodland owner or if you know woodland owners, I strongly encourage them and you to communicate with others who have a vested interest in that property. That may be children, that may be heirs, who are going to be the next caretakers of that land. Getting them engaged, getting them involved with the property is a great way to kind of build those connections and set them up to be good woodland stewards like you're trying to do yourself. So communicate why you value your woodlands and communicate what you're doing to enhance those values, not only for yourself, but for your community, your county, the state, our nation, and future generations. And if you are a woodland owner, do you have a current management plan? That's an important thing. We talked about that, and hopefully through these presentations, you've gained a greater appreciation for the importance of a woodland management plan. And make sure that that plan reflects your values, right? So if you don't have a plan, first, please get one, right? There's so much value in having that woodland management plan. It's really kind of that first step in getting you started down your woodland stewardship journey. And if you got an older plan and it needs updating to reflect maybe something's changed on your property, or maybe your values with why you care about that property have changed for whatever reason, you need to make sure that your plan reflects that. Again, that plan is our roadmap. That's our guide to caring for our woodlands. So we want to make sure that it's current and it's up to date as far as what your values are and what the conditions in your woodlands are. And again, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation about the values that our woodlands provide and the many different attributes our woodlands provide. But think of these values kind of as a guiding force, if you will, on what we're going to do with our property. They're going to lead our actions and the activities, and all the decisions that we make on our property are really being guided by our values. So I can't thank you enough for choosing to care about our woodlands, and even trying to learn more about caring for woodlands and the work that you've done in the past and the work you'll do in the future. We need our woodland owners in Kentucky to care for and manage their woodlands. And that's why all these organizations are available to support and help you. So make sure you're taking advantage of those resources. Um, because there's a lot, right? And as a reminder, these are some of the things we talked about our woodlands. If you missed the first two parts of this three-part series, those are available on FromTheWoodsToday.com or on our YouTube page for UK Forestry Natural Resources Extension. You can see all three parts there. But as you can see, our woodlands provide a lot of values, and we can do things to enhance those values. And if you ever have any questions, or I can help you get connected to the appropriate resources here in Kentucky, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you.
Well, that was a great presentation, Billy. I really appreciate you doing that. And except, you're kind of setting Dr. Matt Springer up to be able to talk about, the wildlife importance with that. Speaking of Dr. Matt Springer, there he is.
Greetings.
Welcome to the show. We appreciate you being on again.
Glad to be back, and happy birthday, Billy.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
So, and I appreciate you setting up a little bit of the context of my talk here with, what woodlands bring to wildlife. So we're going to hopefully reverse here and talk a little bit about the value that wildlife can bring to your woodlands and your property.
Awesome. All right. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Dr. Springer.
Thank you.
All right. So, many times I've been on here, I talk about creating wildlife habitat and trying to increase the value of your property for wildlife. And based on what Billy was just talking about, he did a really good job discussing options on how you can be a great caretaker of your property, and getting with professionals and trying to improve things to meet the goals of your property, and hopefully wildlife may be one of those goals. And at the very least, a healthy forest is good for wildlife, even if it's not one of your goals. But let's kind of turn this around a little bit and talk a bit about what can wildlife do for you in some ways, or at the very least, what is wildlife doing for you and you don't know it. So woodlands do play this vital role as a place for wildlife to exist, to live, providing some or all of what these species need to survive and reproduce, whether that's the food coming off of those white oaks that are there for deer and bear and turkeys and all kinds of animals, or whether it's just the structure of the vegetation itself, giving a place for a bird to build a nest and raise its young. So all of that's there, but what is going on in the background that kind of is this interplay between wildlife and the woodlands? And often we jump to this idea of the recreational use. That's the value that can be brought, and it makes sense as it's a very common recreational use of wildlife. It's one that about 1 in 20 Americans partake in, right? So about 5% of the country is a person that buys a hunting license. And there's a lot of economic benefits that come from that, in terms of our economy within the state, nationally. If you look at, on average, a hunter is going to spend a little over $3,000 to partake in this recreational activity. And this can be a huge influx of funds into rural areas, whether that be in hotels or restaurants, gas stations, or one that we're going to talk about in a little bit here, where they're purchasing access to properties to partake in this recreational activity, especially if they're not landowners themselves. On top of that, the value that wildlife brings, so if you are lucky enough to harvest one of these animals, it can be a substantial amount of high quality, nutritious food for your personal consumption or family's consumption, or in many cases now, pretty much every state that has hunting has some form of a Hunters for the Hungry program where folks that are lucky enough to have a surplus of individual animals on their property, maybe they have problems with things like crop damage. They're harvesting more than they personally need to consume, and they can donate that high quality, nutritious meal to a food bank using this program, Hunters for the Hungry. In Kentucky alone, we're looking at, somewhere, off the top of my head, I may be wrong, but I believe it was about 50,000 pounds of venison was donated in Kentucky last year, providing, tons and tons of meals to folks that may be not in a great situation. And that is high quality protein, which is usually the most expensive part of a meal. And the state views that as a valuable program and actually provides funds, whether that through the state itself or private entities donating to have the animals processed for free at no cost to the hunters. So it is a recreational opportunity that provides an influx into economies, as well as providing a nutritious meal to either the families that harvest it or potentially those who are a little less fortunate at the time. So it's a big value that wildlife can bring. Specifically in Kentucky, if you want to break that down, Billy mentioned the approximately $18 billion economic impact that the forest industry has. In the fish and wildlife recreation realm in the state of Kentucky, it's estimated to be about a $6 billion industry, and it's supporting about 70,000 jobs. We have quite a few participants. This is lumping in fishing, boating, hunting, and wildlife recreation. So that can be things like wildlife photography, bird watching, all of that. So it is a major input into Kentucky tourism. It's making up almost half of that industry based on these estimates. So it is a driving force of bringing people into Kentucky and potentially bringing value to your property depending on what kind of interest you have and how you want to use your property. I mentioned that economic gain can be realized by our woodland owners, many of which are realizing it in one way or another, even if they are not participants in hunting as a recreational activity. And that is through the idea of hunt leasing. So this is where individuals who are partaking in hunting or fishing or other recreational opportunities are basically paying access to the landowner to access the land, um, and partake in that activity. And the values can range quite a bit and are related to the resources present on the property, the situation of how large the property is, what kind of amenities are there, where is that property in the state, and what is basically playing into is what kind of experience can the leasee have within that property. And that will, either increase the value of the property or potentially keep it at a lower level. And some of that can be out of the leasee's hands, the owner's hands. Sorry, not the leasee. Where if you have a property in Southeast Kentucky and have elk on it, then you have a resource that's much more limited than most of the rest of the state. And if you're someone that is trying to potentially have elk hunting as a business, if you're an elk guide, then you're not going to be interested in trying to lease out property out by Lake Cumberland, let's say. You're going to want to have it in the area that's open to hunting. The same holds true for things like waterfowl, especially. If you are in an area that has a lot of waterfowl present, there's a lot of resource there, then your value of that property is going to go up. And by no means is this necessarily going to be the only thing that the landowner uses to make money, but it can be a substantial amount of income depending on your personal situation. I have heard rates as high as $60 an acre on an annual basis for hunt leasing for deer in certain counties. and can be even higher in situations, per se, elk leases or specific waterfowl scenarios that are maybe immediately adjacent to a wetland refuge, where there's only so many places that can have access to those birds and hunting those birds. Um, when I was in the Eastern Shore doing my master's work, a lot of the goose pits that were right next to the refuges in a single cornfield could go upwards of almost six figures, depending on where you were and the market that was available for those interested in leasing them. But more widespread, outside of the hunt lease component, more widespread of the value that wildlife bring to your woodlands is usually directly related to the ecological services that those species have in that system. And it's really hard to put a dollar amount on a lot of these activities that are really a vital role for making your woodlands function like it's supposed to. We're going to go over a few different main ones per se, but if you lose a vital species in a system, that system's never going to be the same, and it's hard to necessarily replace that individual species there with other ones. They just don't operate the same. Um, Often, we can overlook things that we see on a regular basis. Right. So often I look out my back window in my yard and I see a squirrel running around with a acorn and not think about, well, that squirrel's just burying that nut for next year or this winter to find and to eat at a later time. So caching that acorn is only for that squirrel in my mind. But in reality, being squirrels and chipmunks and many rodents catch a lot of acorns and other nuts that they do not consume that play into the regeneration of our future trees and other plants. On top of that, they're moving seeds around very quickly and putting them in places that maybe there wasn't an oak tree before or in the recent past. They are now putting an acorn there that could be an oak tree in the future and help move these species to places they can't, right? Trees can't walk around and start throwing their acorns everywhere. They're stuck in one spot. So they need something to do that for them. And in many cases, wildlife are the things that do that. And in some extreme cases of seed dispersal, they actually require wildlife to be a component of that. So some species like our raspberry and blackberries actually need to pass through the gizzard of a bird in order to germinate and become a plant in the future. So they not only do they need that bird to move them around, they also need that bird to activate the seed. Other ones that we are often thinking about, especially now in the time where we hear about monarchs and bees being not necessarily in great shape, we're very familiar with the idea of pollination and the role that plays in making sure that we have seeds for future plants as well as food for ourselves. Many of our bats and birds and bees and all the other insects are playing this really vital role of pollinating plants as they go around, not even knowing what they're doing, right? They're not signing up for this job. They're just going about trying to get some food, but they're also playing an incredibly vital role to make sure that these plants are reproducing and having more success and having other plants, and seeds for the next generation. This is incredibly true if you are a big tequila drinker, where you need a very specific bat species that likes the agave plants so that you have that tequila present in the future. So those are kind of two that we grasp on pretty easy, and they're really direct, right? So squirrels plant acorns, acorns turn into oak trees, so on and so forth. Hummingbirds go from plant to plant. They get nectar, but they also are bringing pollen with them. Straightforward. One of the bigger ones that is sometimes a little harder to kind of grasp how important it is can involve the idea of pest management. And often these pests are wildlife and insect species themselves. So these are kind of just us trying to grow food in a system and other things like that food we're growing. So we somewhat need to rely on the natural predators to help us deal with that problem. And I'm going to try to focus on the examples of where we have tried to control the pests themselves and failed miserably because it's really hard to do sometimes. For example, we do a lot of spraying in agriculture and yet still have problems with insect pests. And bats have been identified as one that plays an incredibly important role, and bats are not alone here, but it plays an incredibly important role in consuming a lot of those insects in these areas and play a vital role in the agricultural system to keep insect numbers down and keep our crop production up. Estimates are very wide ranging because it's really hard to calculate this, but we're talking billions of dollars in services, not necessarily millions. So they are incredibly important, just out there doing their thing to our lives and our production of food. On top of that, rodents is another really probably one of the worst in terms of mammals, one of the worst agricultural pests worldwide. So anything that consumes a rodent is a win. So things like raptors and snakes, can do this really efficiently. I had that barn owl there, a picture of it here on the pest management slide. This owl is in a vineyard in California, and they have really started pushing in these vineyards in California to get away from using rodenticide and relying a lot more on barn owls and putting up barn owl nesting boxes because they're consuming thousands of rodents in these fields a year and do so at a much higher rate than even using the toxicants, which are becoming more and more restricted in that state. A nest of barn owls, they're basically consuming 3 to 5 dozen rodents a day. So imagine like all these not so pretty, not so cute looking babies, right? They're a little weird looking at times. They are adorable to their parents, I'm sure. But they eat a lot of voles and mice every day as they grow. So they're consuming more than the rodents are reproducing, therefore getting a net positive for keeping agricultural damage down. So things like snakes, things like owls, and things like coyotes and foxes, bobcats are all doing this and working towards it. So there's a big benefit from having those predators around in the rodent control department. On top of that, these guys are consuming pests, but they're also playing this cleanup crew role where our scavengers are out there as animals die, whether that's wildlife or potentially livestock. Their bodies are decomposing on the landscape. Well, the longer they're out there decomposing, the more bacterial growth you have and the possibility of actually creating a problem in terms of bacteria in the future. We do a lot of work giving antibiotics to animals, and we're basically kind of playing this constant game of trying not to create a superbug. And getting more dead animals off the landscape means less bacteria on the landscape, which is a net positive for that goal. So having things like vultures and coyotes out there consuming a lot of dead animals, right? So we have a lot of deer vehicle collisions. Not every county is able to get those animals off the landscape quickly. The vultures are doing it for us. So they're providing a real benefit. And in a very indirect way, they're also doing something that in other countries where they've lost vultures because of poisoning, they had things like rabies outbreaks because feral dogs were filling that role. And there was a rabies outbreak, and all of a sudden those feral dogs were biting humans. So it became a huge public health concern just because the dog population filled into that role of eating carrion. They had a huge burst of dogs, in terms of explosion of dogs because of all the food that was available, and then transferred into something else that was really unexpected. So these guys are really kind of playing this role that none of us want to go out and pick up dead animals out of the landscape, especially in 90 degrees in July. Let's let the vultures kind of do it for us. One that is kind of a benefit and a problem all at the same time is, wetlands provide us a huge service in terms of being able to buffer against floods, water quality improvements, and so on and so forth. And many times we're relying on, in some systems, relying on beavers to create those wetlands by building dams and slowing down the flow of water. And if you live immediately next to those dams, you may actually be getting a net negative on this because the flooding is going to happen at your property. But if you live downstream, it's a bonus. Everything here seems to be a plus minus, and that's really true with a lot of wildlife. But there are still things going on in terms of the system that are positive. And one of these is, you get those ponding, the wetland areas get created, they kind of expand at the same time and do provide some buffer from flooding events. Lastly here, the one that is a value net gain, I will say is personal enjoyment and fulfillment of having wildlife on your property. It's hard to see that gain, but there's a lot of research that shows that activities in the recreation, having animals on your property, those that enjoy that idea and are not this is the non-consumptive side, it really boosts their happiness level. There's evidence that going through activities like forest management and then seeing the gain of those wildlife as indicators of success really helps kind of ensure that that what you did was a positive for the system, and you're then more likely to continue active management because the wildlife are acting kind of as that feedback mechanism of success. We often overlook that, but it does provide a huge mental and emotional benefit and value to your woodland and to yourself as a woodland owner to see those wildlife species there, even on the non-consumptive side. I threw the snake up there just because, yes, they fall into that category too. If you look, that little girl is smiling. They're ones that we often overlook as bringing enjoyment and value, but they really are one that does so. And with that, that's kind of really quick synopsis of some of the values that wildlife can bring to your woodlands, whether that be direct economic impact or emotional and happiness gain from having your woodlands.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yeah, I loved it. That was awesome. Yeah, greatly appreciate that. And I know just me personally, I can go outside and, next thing I know, I'm watching a bird or, watching some little animal. And it's just something that I get enjoyment from. So, I know a lot of people do. So thank you for all the reminders that we appreciate. Sometimes we need that, we need to just calm down and go out and just enjoy nature.
Yep. Grab a cup of coffee, sit outside and listen to those birds sing.
No doubt. Oh, good stuff, Dr. Springer. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Great show today, Billy. I appreciated you being on. Appreciated Dr. Springer being on. So, talking about the importance of woodlands and wildlife, and that's just something that, like we said earlier, some of us may just take for granted sometimes.
No doubt. We need to always kind of, I guess, appreciate, what we have. But again, we want to try to help you all be good stewards of your property, right? So much of what we try to do on the show and out of our department is trying to support woodland owners and those who support them to be good caretakers. So we thank you all for your interest in trying to learn more about your woodlands and wildlife. And if we could ever be of assistance, let us know. If you'd like to see something on a future show, let us know, and we might try to feature that. We can get your input through fromthewoodstoday.com. We have a little survey link. You can hit us up there and let us know what you'd like to see, what could help you be a better woodland steward, or what could help you help somebody who owns woodlands. We want to hit those things the best we can. But Renee, always a pleasure being with you as well.
Definitely. And I appreciate you being on as well. So if you did miss by chance any one of Billy's part 3 sessions, if you go to fromthewoodstoday.com, they are there as well. I think he mentioned that earlier, but just so you know, if you're like, oh, I just got the 3rd one, then you can go back and you can watch the other 2. Okay. So we greatly appreciate you joining us, and we will see you next week at 11. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
From the woods today. From the woods today.